This is another one of my favorite quotes from The Art of War. He who knows the direct and indirect approach will be victorious. Such is the art of maneuver. And I can tell you that when you look at historically military history, even business history of companies duking it out in the battlefront, and whether it's on the military front or the consumer front, it's all relative, is that the indirect approach always wins. And in fact, you look at Napoleon as an example. He used the indirect approach to conquer the world for a period of time. But when you look at business, there are so many examples that I could spend hours talking about it. But just from the top of my head, what I'll do is I'll continue with a couple battles that you're seeing today in the marketplace. So for instance, I talked about in a previous episode that Apple and Samsung are duking it out in the marketplace. And of course, the first category that they really started going at each other was the smartphone sector. Apple came out first, Samsung used extraordinary speed to catch up. And now, of course, you've got the smartwatch sector that's being duked out as well. And of course, Samsung used the smartwatch as an indirect method to attack Apple because the smartwatch obviously is complementary to their smartphone, so they are using an indirect method to attack Apple. And one of the other things that from a smartphone perspective, what they've done that's really brilliant and so simple, and that's one of the things that I wanted to discuss, is that when you're using an indirect approach, it doesn't have to be rocket science strategy. You don't have to read 15 business strategy books to get it. So when you're using the indirect approach, you can do something simple as size. And so Apple obviously had a certain size to their phone, and Samsung simply realized that the consumer wanted a bigger screen, so they just came out with a bigger smartphone. And I can tell you that that was one of the things that worked for him. Now, if you look at the battles being fought today in the marketplace, I think another really cool battle that's kind of happened indirectly is actually the battle between Microsoft and Google. And of course, you know, when you look at these two entities, obviously Google was just a little company. In fact, one of my friends, I know a friend of mine in Silicon Valley that was in the same office where the Google guys started, and they were talking about, this is way before Google made it big or even, I think, raised serious funding, and he was working in the same facility as they were in their startup, and they're like, who are these guys? Oh, they're just Google, and they're doing some search engine stuff, and now we know. But bottom line is that if you look at the Microsoft-Google war, one of the wars that was fought was in the operating systems. Okay, I figured out you were going to think I was going to talk about the Google search side of it, but I'm not. It's actually a very interesting case. So obviously we know that Microsoft owned the operating system on PCs. Okay? And now, if you are a new entrant into the marketplace, then there's no way, because they had such a huge dominance. They owned that market. They owned that terrain. There was no way you could literally compete against Microsoft. In fact, when I was in Silicon Valley 10 years ago, I tried to figure out how to compete with Microsoft on the operating side, and I gave up. So what Google has done, and actually Apple too, and that's one of the things about when you're duking out in a marketplace, is that sometimes you have different players come in and want to duke it out in the operating system arena. So Google obviously came out with Android system, and Apple came out with iOS. And so now you've got, here you have a little, so if you look at the operating system sector, if you look at it like in segments, what you had was the PC side was dominated by Microsoft, and then the other opportunity obviously was to come out with the phone side. And initially Nokia was one of the major players in it, but they blew it. They actually came out with a smartphone in early 2000s, but they completely blew it because they just didn't have the right skill set to pull it off. And so what you had was you had Google and Apple come out with their own operating systems for the smartphone. Apple, of course, used more of a walled garden approach where they controlled the entire process, you know, from the hardware all the way to the operating system and all that. Of course, they let the app developers come in and make money off of it, and so that was smart of them to enable the platform to monetize for others. But what's interesting about Google is that they actually used a Microsoft PC operating system approach, because what they did was they enabled other hardware manufacturers to use their operating system, customize it, and go into the marketplace. So what you have today is really simple, and this is why Microsoft is suffering. They completely misread the market. Okay, when you look at the operating systems, all right, if you look at the, you can look at the operating systems on this side, and you look at it from a size perspective, you probably had, obviously, I don't have the figures right now, but I can tell you that the operating system for PCs was up and away, and then at some point it started declining because smartphones started coming into play. So it really comes down to that, where Microsoft is losing the war, and I just can't see how they're going to catch up, is on the operating system side, is that they still thought that PC sales were going to go forever, and we've seen trends that from IDC data and all that the PC shipments are declining rapidly, where they came out with the smartphone alternative for the consumer, the Apple and Google. And of course now you have Amazon in that as well, with an Android type of a operating system. So basically Microsoft has gotten flanked by Apple, Google, Samsung, and Amazon on the smartphone side. And now what's happening is that you have PCs, and it all comes down to, obviously, and this is what people forget, it always comes down to the consumer. Okay? That's really what it comes down to. So the consumer started using PCs less and less. Smartphones, because it's mobile, you can use so much, do so much with it, started increasing. And of course now, if you can, because of the internet, all these cloud services and all these different applications and apps that you can use on smartphones and tablets being increased in usage. So what you have is a classic, absolutely classic case of an indirect attack against Microsoft. They're flanking Microsoft on the operating system side, because the consumerization of everything. In fact, you'll see that in the media now. It's like the word consumerization of all types of products and services, even at the enterprise level. So what's happened is that here's where the problem with Microsoft is even today. It's not that rocket science. I don't need to have a degree or an MBA. Is that if you look at Microsoft, okay, what they've done is they've made money on the consumer side, and of course business side. But now the operating system wars, okay, are being shifted from PCs to smaller devices, and this is where their foothold is being basically taken underneath them by Amazon, by Android, by Amazon, by Google, by Apple, by Samsung. And now you have even more entrants coming into it from China, the low-cost manufacturers that are using Android operating systems. So it was a classic move by Google to attack the operating system market by shifting the battlefront from a PC-based marketplace to a smartphone tablet marketplace. And so from my perspective, Microsoft's in trouble. I don't know how they're going to come out of this. Obviously they bought Nokia, and I do like the way the Nokia phone looks. In fact, I think it looks better than Samsung's, but I've not used it, so don't quote me on how well it works. But what you have here is a classic case of an indirect attack by the new entrants and going after the largest player in the marketplace. So when it comes to the operating system wars, what you have is a scenario where Microsoft's in trouble. And now in the automobile industry, you could say that there's a classic case of a flanking maneuver, indirect maneuver happening as well. You've got all these traditional auto manufacturers, and I would say, when I say traditional, I would say they're more like gas powered. And of course that's changing. I'm a big fan of Toyota because I understand their Toyota production system pretty well. I've studied it for 10-15 years, but bottom line is that you have the traditional market, and of course there are some instances of like Toyota Prius coming out with hybrids. So now you have the hybrids coming out, and now you have every manufacturer out there trying to do it. And then on this side you have Tesla Motors coming out with the electric car. So you could say that Tesla used an indirect attack against the automobile industry by going into a definitely new market. From what I saw on Bloomberg TV, I think they're valued right now at $20 billion. So it is once again a classic indirect attack, but let's not forget that when you're dealing with business, what you're really doing is you're attacking certain markets. And now you have to figure out how to deal with the dynamics of the competition within the market. In war, of course, you most of the time have certain sides picked. So for instance, in World War II, obviously you had the Allies going against Germany, and so there's a consortium of people that were trying to fight Germany, let's say in Europe. So what's happened is that you're able to have alliances come into play and compete against one player. The unfortunate part in business is that if you're talking about, for instance, the smartphone sector, you have multiple players. You've got Google, you have Amazon, well, not Amazon. I'm surprised Amazon hasn't come out with the phone yet. You have Google, you have Apple, obviously you have Samsung, Microsoft now with Nokia, and so they're all trying to duke it out. But obviously from an operating systems perspective, it's really come down to Google and Apple. And Google is of course using a licensing strategy, so they're using, ironically, the Microsoft PC operating system strategy to penetrate the market. And so the positive for Apple is that they are standardized, so they're able to compete in the consumer marketplace with a standardized product. The negative for Google is there's fragmentation of their operating system because of the various devices. So on one hand, Google has fragmented the market in terms of Android because you have different hardware manufacturers using it for their own purposes. But by the same token, even though there's fragmentation, you're still having a tremendous penetration. In fact, the Android platform is the most dominant platform today when it comes to smartphones. So they kind of had to use a strategy where the hardware manufacturers can customize the Android operating system somewhat, and then use their marketing firepower and all their businesses and distribution channels to push their own products into the marketplace. So in summary, if I can give you any advice, is that when you're looking at attacking a market, obviously you have to know who you're competing against on one end, but also think about approaching it from an indirect versus direct perspective. And so obviously if you're a startup, you're going to want to compete indirectly because you don't have the resources or the financial firepower to compete directly against someone. And even if you did, even if you had all the resources from a financial perspective, talent and all that, there's no need to compete direct. Military history has proven that the indirect form of attack is always victorious. Until next time.